Imagine paying for something you own, only to be fined for using it. That's exactly what happened when HOA Karen tried to take away my right to enjoy my own pool. But when she crossed the line, I decided to lock it up and kick everyone out. You won't believe what happened next. The Homeowners Association HOA issue had been brewing for a while before it came to a head. It all started when I moved into my new home, which came with a beautiful backyard and, more importantly, a private pool. As someone who had worked hard for years to finally afford a place like this, I was excited about the small luxuries like relaxing by the pool during warm summer evenings. Little did I know, the HOA had a different vision for how I should be using my property. For those unfamiliar, an HOA is essentially an organization that enforces rules in residential communities. These rules cover everything from the exterior color of your house to noise levels and, in some cases, how you can use your backyard. At first, I didn't think much about the HOA. I figured they were there to ensure the community remained pleasant and well kept, and I'd always been the kind of person who abides by rules. However, I soon learned that the HOA had a much tighter grip on what I could and couldn't do with my own property. A few months after settling in, I received a letter from the HOA. It was rather formal, which was to be expected, but the contents, inside, were nothing short of surprising. The letter stated that I had violated one of their policies by using my pool. This wasn't some minor infraction. The letter outlined a hefty fine for simply enjoying the pool during the summer months. Apparently, the HOA had a rule about how pools should be maintained and used within the community. They didn't explicitly state it in the documents they had given me when I bought the house, and they hadn't made it clear during the numerous meetings they held to welcome new residents. Nonetheless, there it was. A fine for using my own property. I was stunned. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. After all, how could anyone fine someone for using their own pool in their own yard? But there it was, in black and white. The fine wasn't small either. It was significant enough to make me question whether I had unknowingly violated some rule. I immediately went through the HOA's handbook to find anything that could explain this bizarre penalty. That's when I realized they had imposed a rule that pools in the neighborhood could only be used for approved gatherings and specific hours. Essentially, they were regulating when and how I could use my pool, even though it was in my own backyard. The more I looked into it, the angrier I became. This was my pool, my home, my property, and yet the HOA was telling me I couldn't enjoy it whenever I wanted. The letter also mentioned that I would be fined every time they saw me using the pool outside of these approved hours. I tried to reason with myself, thinking there must be a mistake, or perhaps I had missed an important detail. But there was no mistake. The HOA's rulebook was clear, and I was in violation. What followed was a series of emails and phone calls with HOA representatives. They didn't seem particularly interested in hearing my side of the story. In fact, I felt like my concerns were being brushed aside. Every conversation I had with them felt increasingly frustrating. I pointed out that this fine was unreasonable and asked for a compromise, such as extending the hours for pool use. I even offered to attend a community meeting to discuss the situation openly. However, the response was always the same. The fine would stand, and there would be no exceptions. To make matters worse, the individual behind the enforcement of these rules was none other than Karen, a particularly aggressive HOA board member who seemed determined to make an example out of me. She was known for her strict adherence to HOA regulations and her somewhat overbearing nature when it came to enforcing them. Word quickly spread around the neighborhood about my situation, and while some neighbors sympathized with me, others didn't seem to care or were too afraid to speak up. I soon realized that I wasn't just dealing with a matter of property rights. I was facing a battle against an institution that had a long history of enforcing its rules without much regard. For the individual circumstances of the residents, I wasn't ready to back down. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about the pool. It was about standing up for my rights as a homeowner. I had already paid the hefty price for the house, and now I was being penalized for enjoying the very features that made it special. The situation was escalating quickly, and I knew I had to take action. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I was going to lock the pool up and put an end to the HOA's ability to dictate how and when I could enjoy my own property. This was more than just a disagreement over a pool. It became a matter of principle. It wasn't about the fine itself, but about the invasive nature of the HOA's rules and the fact that they were willing to take away something that brought me joy and relaxation in my own home. What happened next would set off a chain of events that no one, not even the HOA, could have predicted. Karen's approach was as confrontational as I had expected. She was the one who had initiated the fine in the first place, and I knew she wasn't someone who would back down easily. As a prominent member of the HOA, Karen had built a reputation for herself as someone who enforced the rules with strict precision, often without regard for individual circumstances. So, when I received the official letter about the fine, it wasn't entirely surprising that she would be the one to personally follow up. What surprised me, however, was the audacity with which she carried out her actions. Her first visit was brief but direct. She showed up unannounced one afternoon, her expression as rigid and stern as ever. Without even a courtesy introduction, she immediately began lecturing me about the violations I had committed by using my pool. Her tone was harsh, as though she believed that the issue was already settled in her mind. There was no room for discussion, no attempt to understand the situation from my perspective. As far as Karen was concerned, I had broken the rules, and that was the end of the matter. She went on to explain that my pool had been used outside of the approved hours outlined by the HOA's regulations. The HOA had a policy that stated pools could only be used during certain times of the day, specifically between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. This rule, she told me, was put in place to maintain peace and quiet within the community, as if my occasional use of the pool at 5 p.m. was causing widespread chaos. She also claimed that the use of my pool after hours was a disturbance to the community and could lead to complaints from my neighbors, though no such complaints had been formally filed against me. I tried to explain that the rules were unreasonable. After all, it was my property, and I should be able to use my pool when I pleased, within reason. But Karen wasn't interested in hearing that. She repeatedly emphasized that it didn't matter how I felt about the policy. The rule was in place, and I had violated it, plain and simple. What made it worse was that Karen, as a representative of the HOA, seemed completely indifferent to any argument I presented. She wasn't there to negotiate. She was there to enforce, and she expected me to accept her demands without question. The absurdity of the fine became clear as she continued speaking. According to her, the fine would only increase if I continued using the pool after hours. It was a penalty system designed to punish me until I complied. What struck me as particularly frustrating was how Karen, as the person most vocal about these rules, seemed to have no real sense of fairness or flexibility. There was no room for empathy, no consideration for the fact that this was my home, my space, and my pool. It was a blanket rule applied with no regard for context. If Karen had been willing to hear me out or even discuss the matter rationally, things might have gone differently. But instead, she treated me as though I was a mere violator of a rule that had little to do with the practical realities of living in a residential neighborhood. At that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about a pool or a minor infraction. It was about an overbearing institution trying to dictate every aspect of my life, down to when I could take a swim in my own backyard. The HOA wasn't simply enforcing a rule, it was imposing a way of life that removed any semblance of personal freedom. This wasn't a small disagreement over a minor violation. It was a direct challenge to my autonomy as a homeowner. The more Karen spoke, the more I felt that the HOA, under her leadership, wasn't interested in fostering a peaceful community. They were focused on power, control, and making sure that everyone stayed within their rigid, often nonsensical guidelines. Karen stood there, rattling off the details of the fine and the possible consequences for not complying. I couldn't help but feel like this was all part of a larger pattern. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was indicative of a culture within the HOA that valued strict adherence to rules over common sense or personal freedoms. Karen wasn't just a rule enforcer. She was a symbol of everything I had come to despise about the HOA system. It wasn't about maintaining harmony or fairness. It was about exercising authority and punishing those who dared to challenge it. Her demands were clear. I had to stop using the pool outside of the approved hours, or I would face more fines. She didn't care about the fact that I was trying to enjoy a peaceful evening or that my neighbors hadn't complained. She didn't care about the fact that I had purchased the home and paid for the right to enjoy it in whatever way I saw fit. All she cared about was making sure the rules were followed, no matter how ridiculous they seemed. And, as if that wasn't enough, Karen made it clear that she wouldn't back down until I had complied with her demands. It was at that moment that I realized this wasn't just a battle over a pool or a fine. It was a battle for my rights as a homeowner, and I wasn't about to let the HOA dictate how I could live in my own home. This was bigger than just a minor dispute. It was about standing up to an institution that was more interested in control than fairness. Karen's demand was the spark that ignited a much larger confrontation, one that would force me to make a choice, comply with an unreasonable set of rules, or take a stand and fight for my freedom. Upon hearing Karen's demands, a rush of emotions hit me all at once. Frustration, anger, disbelief, and confusion. I couldn't fathom how an organization that was supposed to foster community harmony was instead infringing on my personal rights in such a blatant way. My pool was supposed to be a sanctuary, a small luxury I had worked so hard for, and now it felt like it was being taken from me. The fine, the harsh tone of Karen's voice, and the absurdity of the rule all seemed too much to bear. I knew I had to make a decision, and fast. At first, I considered complying with the HOA's demand. It seemed easier to just follow the rules and pay the fine, even though I felt it was unfair. Maybe I could avoid further confrontation and just deal with the situation quietly. After all, I didn't want to start an all-out war with the HOA or disturb the peace in the neighborhood. However, the more I thought about it, the more the idea of giving in seemed impossible. This wasn't about a simple pool schedule. It was about control and the right to enjoy the space I had worked so hard to obtain. The idea of locking up the pool came to me almost instinctively. The more I considered it, the more it seemed like the only way to take control back from Karen and the HOA. If they weren't going to let me enjoy the pool as I saw fit, then perhaps I could turn the tables and prevent anyone else from using it either. It wasn't about being petty. It was about reclaiming what was mine and showing the HOA that their overreach would not be tolerated. They had tried to impose a set of arbitrary rules on me, and now I had the power to impose my own rule, one that took their authority away. Locking up the pool wasn't a decision I made lightly. I knew that it would cause some friction within the neighborhood, and there was a chance that it could escalate the situation further. But at that moment, I realized that I was dealing with a system that wouldn't stop until it had asserted its dominance. It was clear that the HOA wasn't interested in compromise or fairness. The more I tried to reason with them, the more they seemed to dig their heels in. I knew that this was a battle I couldn't win through negotiation alone. I needed to take a stand in a way that would get their attention. The act of locking up the pool was, in a sense, a statement. It was a way to draw a hard line in the sand and say, if I can't enjoy my pool when I want, then no one else will either. I had the power to control who used the pool, and I was going to exercise that power in a way that would force the HOA to reconsider its approach. I didn't just want to stop using the pool during certain hours. I wanted the HOA to understand that I wasn't going to let them walk all over me. The moment I decided to lock up the pool was the moment I realized I had taken back control of the situation. It wasn't about being spiteful or acting out of anger. It was about asserting my right as a homeowner to enjoy my property without interference. The pool wasn't just a luxury. It was a symbol of my independence, and I wasn't about to let it be taken away by a set of unreasonable rules. The decision to lock the pool was, in many ways, a turning point. It marked the moment when I stopped being a passive participant in the HOA's rules and became an active agent in my own life. By locking up the pool, I was sending a clear message to the HOA that I wasn't going to let them dictate how I lived in my own home. I wasn't going to allow a single person or a group of people to take away my right to use my property as I saw fit. It wasn't just about the pool. It was about my right to make decisions about my life without interference from an organization that was more interested in imposing its will than in fostering a sense of community. When I locked the pool, I wasn't just taking action against the HOA. I was taking action for myself. I realized that I had the power to stand up for my rights, and that was something I hadn't fully recognized until that moment. The act of locking up the pool wasn't just a response to Karen's demands. It was a response to the larger issue of overreach, control, and the erosion of personal freedoms in a community that should have been about cooperation and mutual respect. The decision to lock the pool wasn't the end of the battle, but it was the first step toward regaining control of my space, my property, and my life. It wasn't about winning a small argument about pool hours. It was about making a statement that would force the HOA to realize that their actions had consequences. And I was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that I had taken a stand for what was right. Once I made the decision to lock the pool, I knew that it would have consequences, but I wasn't prepared for the extent of the fallout that would follow. As soon as the pool was off limits, word spread through the community like wildfire. Neighbors who had previously used the pool for recreational purposes were suddenly left in the dark about when they could return. While I was within my rights to lock up my property, I had to acknowledge that this action affected not only the HOA, but also the people around me. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly the situation would escalate, turning what seemed like a simple matter of enforcing my rights into a larger community-wide issue. The first reaction from the community came from those who had regularly used the pool. Some neighbors were understanding, seeing my decision as an act of resistance against an overbearing HOA. These neighbors were sympathetic to my struggle, and many privately expressed their support for taking a stand. They understood that I was not just trying to be difficult, but was standing up for something much bigger, the right to enjoy my own property without undue interference. However, not everyone shared this view. There were also people who felt inconvenienced or even angered by the decision. To them, the pool was a shared resource, a communal space that added value to the neighborhood. The idea that it would be locked up without warning struck them as unfair and selfish. The first time I saw the community's reaction firsthand was when I noticed a few neighbors gathered outside talking among themselves. Some were clearly upset, questioning why the pool was locked in the first place. Others, perhaps more diplomatically, tried to downplay the situation, suggesting that it could have been handled better. The tension in the air was palpable. In the eyes of some, I had gone from being a quiet, ordinary neighbor to someone who had created a disruption. People who had previously kept their distance began to show up at my door, asking about the pool, questioning my reasons for locking it, and voicing their frustrations. But the most dramatic moment came when the HOA's involvement reached its peak. After a couple of days of community chatter, I received a formal notice from the HOA demanding that I unlock the pool immediately. They cited the communal agreement and the impact on my neighbors. It was clear that the HOA viewed this as an affront not just to their rules, but also to the harmony they believed existed within the neighborhood. According to them, I was putting the entire community's enjoyment of the property at risk, even though the reality was that the HOA's own rules had forced me into this position in the first place. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had set this chain of events into motion, yet they were blaming me for the fallout. At that point, the HOA wasn't just interested in enforcing the rule about the pool. They saw this as a battle for control over the neighborhood, and they needed to assert their authority. The letter they sent was firm, demanding that I comply and that I unlock the pool or face further penalties. The HOA's stance was clear. I could either comply with their rules or they would escalate the situation, possibly involving legal action or fines. Their tone was one of absolute power, and they made it clear that they weren't willing to negotiate or discuss the issue any further. To them, this wasn't just about the pool anymore. It was about maintaining their dominance in the community. The reaction from the HOA further fueled the division within the neighborhood. While a few of my neighbors supported my stance, there were others who sided with the HOA, arguing that the pool was a shared asset that needed to be available to everyone. They believed that the HOA was simply enforcing rules that benefited the greater good of the community. The divide created an almost palpable tension, with lines being drawn between those who supported me and those who backed the HOA. As the days went on, it became increasingly clear that the HOA's involvement had escalated the situation into something much larger than just a pool issue. Despite the pressure from the HOA, I stood firm in my decision. I wasn't about to let them bully me into submission. However, the situation had clearly spiraled out of control. The drama didn't end with the HOA's notice. Soon, I was dealing with neighbors knocking on my door asking if I was really going to keep the pool locked, if I was prepared to face the full weight of the HOA's legal action, and if I was willing to risk further fines. They were worried about what this might mean for the future of the neighborhood, with some even expressing concern that the HOA would target others who didn't toe the line. It became clear that the drama surrounding the locked pool was now a community-wide issue, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. In some ways, locking the pool had exposed the underlying issues within the neighborhood and the HOA itself. People who had quietly followed the HOA's rules for years were beginning to question whether the HOA was really looking out for the best interests of the community or whether it was simply interested in enforcing its power. The HOA's insistence on controlling every aspect of life in the neighborhood had created an environment where even something as personal as a private pool became a point of contention. As the fallout continued, I realized that this battle wasn't just about a pool anymore. It was about standing up to an organization that had grown too comfortable in its role as the ultimate authority. The drama reached its peak when the HOA began organizing a meeting to address the issue. At that meeting, I was forced to defend my decision in front of my neighbors and the HOA board. There, I made it clear that my decision to lock the pool wasn't just about avoiding fines. It was about asserting my right to enjoy my own property without unreasonable interference. It was also about making a point to the HOA that their overreach had consequences, and that I would not allow them to trample over my rights or the rights of others in the community. Ultimately, the HOA was forced to reconsider their position. While they didn't reverse the fine or completely retract their demands, the incident prompted them to open a dialogue with the community about the fairness of certain rules. The community, too, was forced to reflect on how much power they were willing to give the HOA and whether they were comfortable with an organization that exerted so much control over their lives. The locked pool had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond my backyard. It had forced people to question the status quo and consider what kind of community they wanted to live in. After locking the pool, the consequences were inevitable, and they arrived much sooner than I had anticipated. The immediate fallout was a surge in tension, both within the HOA and the community. It was clear that my decision had disrupted the delicate balance that the HOA had tried to maintain, and it forced the organization to take action. The HOA, which had previously dealt with minor infractions by issuing fines or warnings, now faced a situation that demanded a more direct response. The first consequence I faced was an official escalation from the HOA. They didn't waste any time in issuing a formal letter demanding that I unlock the pool. The letter, which was sent with an air of finality, laid out the penalties I would face if I continued to ignore their request. The fine was increased, and the language became even more forceful, suggesting that failure to comply would result in further action, potentially including legal steps. The HOA, in their effort to maintain control, seemed determined to force me to back down. The message was clear. They were not going to let my small act of defiance slide, and they were willing to make an example out of me to show others that the HOA's rules were not to be challenged. On the other hand, Karen, the HOA board member, who had spearheaded the initial fine, took it upon herself to become even more vocal in the matter. She was relentless, sending me repeated emails, phone calls, and even showing up at my door to remind me of the rules. Karen's personal involvement in the situation made it feel more like a personal vendetta rather than a simple enforcement of regulations. She was invested in winning this battle and ensuring that I was penalized for stepping out of line. Her constant presence in the issue only served to escalate the drama, and it became clear that she was using this as an opportunity to assert her authority over me and, by extension, the neighborhood. Despite the increased pressure from the HOA and Karen, I remained firm in my decision. The more they tried to coerce me into compliance, the more I realized that this battle wasn't just about a pool. It was about principle. I had already paid the price for my property, and I wasn't about to let anyone dictate how I could enjoy it. While the HOA and Karen had their rules, I had my rights as a homeowner. They might have been able to impose rules on the community, but they couldn't strip away my ability to make decisions about my own property. This realization fueled my resolve, and I refused to be bullied into submission. However, as the situation continued to escalate, it became clear that my decision was having a ripple effect throughout the neighborhood. The community's reaction was divided. Some neighbors supported me, understanding that I was standing up for my rights and that the HOA's actions were becoming increasingly unreasonable. These neighbors respected my stance and admired my courage in challenging the authority of the HOA. They saw the situation for what it was, an overreach by an organization that had become too powerful and too focused on enforcing rules without considering the broader context. Others, however, felt that I had overstepped my bounds. They viewed the locked pool as a disruption to the communal harmony and a selfish action that affected everyone in the neighborhood. To them, the pool wasn't just a personal asset. It was a shared resource that everyone had the right to access. They argued that by locking it, I had not only created a problem for myself, but had also made it difficult for others who had no part in the dispute. These neighbors believed that the HOA's rules were there for a reason and that they were being undermined by my actions. The divide in the neighborhood grew, and tensions between residents started to surface. The HOA, meanwhile, was not backing down. They continued to press for compliance, threatening further fines and legal action if I didn't unlock the pool. They were relentless, sending legal letters and demanding that I attend a formal meeting to discuss the situation. The HOA's insistence on treating this as a legal matter made it clear that they were determined to make me pay for my defiance. Despite their efforts, however, I stood my ground. I was not going to let them bully me into submission. The final turning point came when the HOA called for a community meeting to address the issue. During the meeting, I was forced to defend my actions in front of my neighbors and the HOA board. I explained that my decision to lock the pool wasn't about being difficult or spiteful. It was about standing up for my rights as a homeowner. I pointed out the unreasonable nature of the fine and how the HOA's overreach had led to this situation. I also emphasized that the HOA needed to reconsider its stance on personal property rights and how their rigid enforcement of rules was damaging the community's sense of trust and fairness. The meeting ended with no immediate resolution, but it did mark a significant moment of change. The HOA was forced to acknowledge that their approach had caused unnecessary tension within the neighborhood. The community, too, was forced to reflect on the power dynamics at play and whether the HOA's control was beneficial or harmful. While the HOA didn't reverse their decision entirely, they did agree to review their policies and make adjustments to ensure that property owners had more flexibility when it came to enjoying their own space. Looking back on the experience, I can say with certainty that it was worth it. Standing up to the HOA wasn't just about winning a battle over a pool, it was about asserting my rights and taking a stand against the overreach of an institution that had become too focused on control. The lessons learned were profound. First, I realized the importance of knowing and standing up for my rights as a homeowner. Second, I learned that sometimes even small actions can spark significant change. By taking a stand, I was able to challenge the status quo and force the HOA to reconsider its policies. Finally, I learned that while the process was difficult and at times frustrating, standing firm in my convictions was ultimately empowering. In the end, the HOA backed off somewhat, and the community gained a valuable lesson in the importance of personal rights versus collective rules. It became clear that change wasn't going to come from appeasing the powers that be. It would come from people being willing to speak up, challenge authority, and demand a better, fairer system for all. The locked pool wasn't just a symbol of defiance, it was a symbol of change. If you've ever felt like your rights were being violated, make sure to subscribe to the HOA Stories for more real-life tales of standing up to the system.